Welcome to the 2048 Olympics here in Athens, Greece. It cannot be denied, not the most impressive Olympics. Just 2 records have been broken by athletes representing a little over 100 countries competing in just 23 sports. Fans here have been nostalgic about the classic Olympics like 2008, 2012, and even 2024. Back when athletes representing over 200 countries participated in over 30 sports, with huge crowds of spectators watching athletes perform faster, higher, and stronger than anyone in human history. This year, small crowds, a lower level of performance, and even less interest from the public than in the disastrous last Olympics in Manila. What happened? And how much longer can the Olympic Games carry on? This century, we can expect the Olympics to decline in popularity and prestige. And that's a pretty bold statement, especially considering how well the current Olympic Games in Paris seem to be going. But while there are many factors that will determine the quality of an Olympic Games this century, in this video I'm going to focus on the one factor that will likely override all of them: climate change. And I'm going to use this depression-ometer to keep track of how depressing different sections of this video will be, starting here with the most obvious factor: heat. As I hope you're aware by now, global average temperatures have increased by between 1 and 1.5 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. Individual years like 2024 are warmer than that though, maybe even more than 1.5 degrees warmer, and individual regions have warmed significantly more than the average. For example, temperatures in Paris are 3.1 degrees Celsius warmer at this time of year during the day than they were in 1924 when Paris last hosted the Olympics. And you might quite reasonably ask, is that really a big deal? It's just a couple of degrees. Well, if you're pushing yourself to the highest level of athletic performance, yes. To explain why, here's YouTube's favourite cardiologist / medical influencer, Dr. Rohin Francis.
Thank you, Simon. Homeostasis is the body's incredibly sophisticated system of maintaining a constant internal environment, and humans can actually operate through quite an impressive range of conditions, but as temperatures climb, that thermoregulatory mechanism gets harder and harder. The 2 main ways that we cool ourselves down are by diverting blood flow to the skin so that heat can radiate away, and by sweating. Exercise itself, of course, generates a large amount of heat from your muscles, and they can increase metabolic activity up to 15 times the resting rate. If the environmental temperature is above or near body temperature, you lose that passive cooling, and it's harder to maintain core temperature. When core temperature starts creeping up, metabolic processes within cells become less efficient. More blood flow to the skin and a homeostatic mechanism to reduce that intrinsic heat generation means less blood flow to muscles, including the most important muscle there is, the oxygen-hungry heart. So performance dips. Heat exhaustion sets in quicker, potentially progressing to heat stroke, which can be fatal. Collapsing athletes are already familiar scenes in endurance events, but remember, this isn't just about what time of year to hold a specific race, but athletes need to train year-round. So if the optimum window gets shorter, performance will decline, unequally affecting athletes in warmer countries, for example, or those without access to controlled facilities. But what about more explosive events like jumps or sprints, where you might think heat would actually help get muscles up to optimum temperature? While less affected than distance runners and endurance athletes, examining the sprint world records, for example, show they were, as far as I can tell, generally all achieved between 18 to 30 degrees Celsius. Some records have already stood for decades, and if conditions worsen fairly soon, it's possible they may never be beaten. Many years ago, I was quite a serious sprinter, and even then, in that bygone epoch, we all noticed that on very hot days, we felt drained even before we'd lined up in the blocks. But then again, increasing temperatures by a degree or 2 might negatively impact performance. It's hardly the end of the world, right?
However, when it comes to the Olympics specifically, it's not just a question of a few degrees. Because extreme heat events, in summer, heat waves, where temperatures are significantly warmer than average, are becoming more common and more extreme due to climate change. As the Rings of Fire report, released ahead of the Paris Olympics, points out, the 2024 Olympics are being held at the same time of year that saw the 2003 heatwave in France, where temperatures rose to over 40 degrees Celsius, 15 degrees more than the average for August, and killed over 70,000 people across Europe. The fear was that something similar could happen this year. Granted, the vast majority of fatalities in 2003 were among the elderly, but asking athletes to perform in conditions like those, conditions that, by the way, may become commonplace in European summers because of climate change, will result in more incidents of heat stroke and heat-related fatalities. That may sound hyperbolic, but it's already happening. Between 2018 and 2022, 11 American football players died from heat stroke. We got a taste of this with the Tokyo Games in 2021, which were the hottest Olympic Games ever. Temperatures hit 34 degrees Celsius, seeing 2 tennis players retire with heat exhaustion, and Russia's Daniil Medvedev famously saying to the umpire, "I can finish the match, but I can die. If I die, are you going to be responsible?" And away from the tennis court, the sand of the beach volleyball pitch was almost too hot to stand on, and long-distance swimmers competed in water of 29 degrees Celsius despite starting at 6:30 in the morning. Researchers at the Sorbonne later described these conditions as close to torture. At the time of recording, the Paris Olympics have not been as hot as Tokyo, though a heat dome, bringing temperatures to nearly 40 degrees Celsius in parts of France, has formed, and that has been attributed directly to climate change. And that has meant that competitors have had to wear ice vests in order to stay cool, and in some sports, the warm-ups have had to be curtailed. And of course, the men's triathlon had to be delayed after extreme rainfall flushed pollution into the Seine, leaving it unsanitary. I can't believe I wrote that. Generally speaking, temperatures have been lower in Paris than experts feared. And if they were higher, sports would now enact their heat protocols. These vary sport by sport, and a good example is in the triathlon.
So the ideal temperature for racing would be somewhere in the mid-20s. So early 20s to mid-20s is the air temperature that is considered ideal for racing for any kind of triathlon, be it the short course or the long course. That is what is ideal, but most of these triathlons now increasing with the climate change have gone to 30 plus degrees. There is almost so much that the core body temperature can increase before we start feeling fatigued and the effects of heat. One athlete might not feel it as much on the cycling, but when it comes to running, the evaporation or the sweating becomes much more, and the impact of the wind on the body is also less. The cooling effect goes away, so the running is when, as athletes, we feel the most impact of the heat.
As such, the World Triathlon Medical Team has a modified traffic light system. If the event is going to take place in temperatures above 30.1 degrees Celsius, then the run portion of the triathlon should be halved in length, and if the event is going to take place in temperatures above 32.2 degrees Celsius, then the event should just be cancelled. However, if those temperatures seem low to you, that's because they're not air temperatures. They are wet bulb temperatures. Simply put, that's the temperature as measured by a thermometer covered with a water-soaked cloth. At 100% humidity, the wet bulb temperature is the same as the air temperature, while at lower humidities, the wet bulb temperature is lower than the air temperature, because of the cooling effects of evaporation.
And that's relevant with regard to sweating, because as the ambient temperature exceeds body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius, which for any Americans watching is about 558 Rankine, simply diverting blood to the skin for heat to radiate away won't cut it anymore. So the body becomes more dependent on the other mechanism of cooling, evaporation. Now, some of this is actually via panting, but of course most is through sweat. Maintaining electrolytes and hydration becomes harder, but more fundamentally, as humidity rises, sweating also loses its function as evaporation declines due to atmospheric moisture levels. What's even worse is that as you sweat, losing in excess of a litre per hour during intense exercise, your blood volume decreases and your plasma tonicity or osmolarity increases, both rendering heat loss by either method less effective. And humidity doesn't just mash up your ability to evaporate sweat, it also affects breathing. I found lots of studies looking at breathing symptoms and physiological measurements showing that people universally report that it's harder to breathe in high humidity, and things like respiratory rate goes up, but I'm not sure we fully understand why yet. It does seem to cause airway swelling, especially in conditions such as asthma, but it might also be a property of how easily we can utilize the oxygen in the air. So overall, when atmospheric temperature is higher than body temperature and humidity is very high as well, the body can no longer effectively regulate its temperature without some external assistance. Both of these are relevant to athletes. Now back to everyone's favourite Warhammer influencer and general purveyor of bad news, Dr. Simon Clark.
Now the bad news. Warmer air can hold more moisture. That's just thermodynamics. And over the past half century, we have seen the global average specific humidity go up. And for the rest of the century, we're going to see that trend continue, which combined with rising temperatures will result in higher and higher wet bulb temperatures for athletes to compete in. The humidity was part of what made the Tokyo Games so punishing for the athletes. They were competing in humidity of nearly 70%, resulting in wet bulb temperatures above 32 degrees, something that mercifully hasn't happened in Paris this year, at least at the time of recording. But this issue is only going to get worse. The conditions in Tokyo will likely become the norm. Athletes will need to perform in ever more punishing conditions, resulting in a degradation of the average quality of performance at the Games, especially affecting endurance events. And it's not just going to affect the athletes. If athletes are going to be performing at a lower level, that's going to make the games slightly less exciting to watch. Athletes won't be jumping quite as high or running quite as fast. Fewer records will be broken, and team sports will have to use slightly less dynamic, exciting strategies. That will make the games slightly less appealing, as will the increased number of errors made by officials forced to endure the same brutal conditions. But do you know what's going to make the games much less appealing? Having to sit or stand in those conditions for hours at a time as an audience member. It is possible to somewhat mitigate this, as we've seen in Paris, but I think it's quite likely that as the summer games heat up, we'll see a gradual decline of audience members for non-air-conditioned events. There's going to be less buzz around these events, which unfortunately means there's probably going to be less funding available for high-level athletes.
Like a lot of funding for most of the sports comes from the spectator pool that we have. It all comes down to, how weather changes impact in the number of people taking sports, and then how many people are actually interested in viewing the sport, because that is how most of the sports get their money.
And this is where we need to leave the stadium, or the road, or the pitch, or the beach, because the Olympic Games themselves are just the final part of an athlete's story, and they don't get there without years and years of training. And hold on to your hats, because this is where we find out how low this thing goes. Decreased audiences and interest means less funding will be available to athletes, but so will the fact that the 21st century is going to see rising costs of adapting to our new, warmer, more extreme climate. Sport is going to drop down the priority list. Many places will become so hot or so frequently hit by extreme weather events that it will be difficult, if not impossible, for athletes to train there. And these two factors together mean that only the best supported athletes from the richest countries can afford to travel to train at the top level.
For any kind of weather condition, be it cold or warm, if you train in that kind of weather that you're going to finally race in, the most optimal results are achieved. Like, you can give the best out of your body. So I think that is definitely a concern. Like, most of the countries wouldn't be able to afford something like this.
There will be a decrease in the diversity of athletes at the Games and a decrease in the number of countries represented. And those that do attend are still training in more challenging conditions and more susceptible to being disrupted by extreme events like wildfires, droughts, and storms.
India is a developing country right now, and they can only fund so many athletes. At the grassroots level, the support is almost minimal. It's like a chicken and egg story that, you get so much support if you perform. And how do you perform? You need support.
And this isn't even to mention the fact that climate change is expected to increase the number of international conflicts this century. See our video on the century we saved Earth for an example of how. And that's going to divert even more funding away from sport. Or the fact that by the mid-century, around a dozen countries currently represented in Paris probably won't be inhabitable anymore. When are we going to see the last Olympic delegation from the Maldives or the Marshall Islands? But perhaps most depressingly of all, in a world where it becomes too hot to play outside in the summer, fewer and fewer children will be involved in outdoor sports. And events like the marathon and the triathlon may well disappear from the grassroots up.
I've already been seeing that a lot of kids are not physically active, and A, that is because of the weather, B, that is lack of facilities that are being available, and C, that is also because a lot of digital kind of sports have come into the scenario, like video games. So I think weather has the biggest impact, that as parents also they're concerned that if their kids go to play in this warm condition, they might fall sick. So I think there is a big impact of number of kids going into physical activities. If the pool gets smaller at the very start, at the grassroots level, then how will the heroes be created? How will champions be recognized?
This paints a really bleak picture for high-level athletics this century, especially for those events that take place outside and that test endurance. The result could well be a 2048 Olympics similar to what I described at the start of the video. Fewer countries represented, fewer sports, lower level, less attention. But hold on just a minute. Compare the 1924 Olympics to the 2024 Olympics. International sport now looks completely different. It's much more organised, better supported by national bodies, and the technology available to athletes is simply incomparable. The 100 metres freestyle world record for men was 59 seconds in 1924, and just 46 seconds in 2024. That improvement was made possible by new training techniques, improved understanding of physiology, and new technologies being used in swimwear, in caps, and in goggles. As I said at the start of the video, climate change will likely be the dominant factor on international sport this century. But other factors still exist. New technologies will be developed that will help keep athletes safe and maintain their level of performance. New forms of media will rise up that will keep people interested in the games and in international athletes. The games themselves can also adapt. New heat protocols can be brought in. Events can be rescheduled to cooler times of the day, as they already are, and some even advocate for the Summer Olympic Games to be entirely rescheduled to a cooler time of the year, though doing so will likely impact athletes' training regimes. The Paris Games, for their part, have made headlines for their sustainability efforts, setting a carbon budget, limiting new construction, and using 100% renewable electricity. Though those aims have come under a lot of criticism by academics for basically just being greenwashing, citing a lack of specificity and transparency and an over-reliance on carbon offsetting. The Games have also come under criticism for accepting sponsorship from polluters such as Coca-Cola, Samsung, and Toyota, though it is worth noting that there are no sponsorship ties whatsoever with any fossil fuel producing companies. Fossil fuel sponsorship is still rife in international sport, however, with national Olympic teams like Team GB and the Australian National Olympic Team accepting money in exchange for positive PR from companies such as British Gas, Hancock Prospecting, Shell, and others. To quote the Rings of Fire report that I mentioned earlier, if sport is going to take its sustainability and environmental commitments seriously to minimize the climate change impacts experienced by athletes and spectators during sporting events, it will need to conduct a radical reassessment of its relationship with fossil fuel companies. Athletes are in a bind here. Funding is hard and will only get harder to come by, and fossil fuel extraction companies are offering it. But to accept such deals is to accept a deal with the devil, rehabilitating the image of and extending our dependence on fossil fossil fuels. Sport is a story of individuals making tough choices and prevailing against the odds. It could be a fantastic example of how society can move past fossil fuels and instead embrace a more sustainable future. And if athletes and spectators take a stand and boot fossil fuel companies out of sport, then we increase the odds of sport as we know it surviving, bringing down our emissions, limiting our damage to the climate. Will the 2048 Olympics really look like this? Have the Olympics peaked and will now face a decline? Maybe. The challenges facing international athletics in maintaining the current level of competition, in running large events, and most importantly, in keeping athletes safe, are immense. But the tools at our disposal for making that happen are also immense. Sport brings people together in a way that basically nothing else does. And the Olympics are perhaps the most awesome thing that we do as a species. I predict that people aren't gonna let that go without a fight. Oh, and for completeness, I thought I'd close by talking about the future of the Winter Olympics. I made a diorama. Normally I end these videos like this, showing you the names of the patrons who made this video possible and imploring you to join them at patreon.com/SimonOxPhys. But because this video is about the Olympics, I thought we could do something a little bit different. It's not an Olympic event, but welcome to the Patreon Marble Race. If you would like to become a patron of this channel, then you get early access to videos, you get exclusive content every month, including a behind-the-scenes vlog every month that's some of my editor's best work, and producer tier patrons and higher get to vote on a video topic a month. Also, executive producer patrons, as well as Steven Spielberg and Henry Cavill tier patrons, get their names up in lights, or at least in the video. And congratulations to the gold medalist Alina Dima, with So-So silver going to Angelo and shameful bronze going to Yayan. Thank you so much to Pragya and to Dr. Francis for chatting to me. Please do check out Rohin's YouTube channel. It's linked down there in the description. He makes phenomenal videos when his job as a consultant cardiologist allows. And thank you very much for watching. If you would like to learn more about this topic, then please do read the full Rings of Fire report. And I can also recommend Warming Up: How Climate Change is Changing Sport. I'll leave links to both of those down in the description. If you'd like to watch something else from me next, then here's 2 videos on screen I prepared earlier. And that just leaves me to say thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.